Very glad to be here, and I'll be recounting experiences from ongoing fieldwork in Washington, D.C. on think tanks. The recent, still ongoing global financial crisis has really highlighted the challenge of governing markets at national as well as at global levels. And the scope that the so-called invisible hand should be allowed is an issue that really occupies center stage in policy debates all across the world. I recently, last spring, spent some time in Washington, D.C. with the aim to study how U.S. think tanks aim to influence policy around the governance of markets domestically as well as globally. And the ethnographic work was carried out at a moment in history when the U.S. state budget reached a remarkable deficit level, and when a government shutdown, unheard of in Scandinavia, was close to reality. And as the deadline for this possible government shutdown on Friday, April the 9th of 2011 drew closer, news headlines like this one underlined the acuteness of the budget breakdown and speculated on plausible implications. Everything from the stop of local trash collection and the writing of parking tickets to the cancellation of the annual cherry blossom parade. A possible government shutdown would question President Obama's leadership across the world and really embarrass the US in front of a worldwide audience. That was sort of the talk of the day. And my agenda was filled to the brim, trying to stay abreast of developments. I followed newspaper reports, TV broadcasts, think tank websites and blogs, and you name it. And really, at the 11th hour, Congress did reach a temporary agreement, and the immediate crisis was brushed aside. But more challenging negotiations were still to follow, as the concrete implications of this agreement were to be drawn up and next year's budget drafted. Now, the drama of this budget crisis was played out in the US Congress, in the corridors of federal government and in the White House, but also involved were think tanks, with experts being interviewed in the news media, hosting seminars, writing op-eds in major papers, but also, and less visibly so, advising, informing, educating politicians by way of personal connections. I found myself to be in the field of mediation, a widely stretched field of mediation or brokerage between knowledge on the one hand and politics on the other. Now, markets are often characterized as evolving in a natural and self-organizing manner, and in practice they fail to do exactly that. The functioning of markets depends on the organizing efforts of a number of actors, private, public, civil society organizations, and there is, as we know, an expanding repertoire of tools by which these actors attempt to organize markets. And in a general sense, the ways of doing this are becoming more complex and involve a number of organizational actors who compete for power and influence. Think tanks are often well equipped to influence agendas outside of regular decision-making channels. They have at their disposal, in the form of endowments, corporate and individual donations, and sponsorship of programs, huge sums of money often that provide them with opportunities to pursue their ideas, do the research they want to do, and to exert some influence on decision makers. And also, the positions of prominence inside of think tanks bring with them cross-cutting ties of influence in other areas as well. So the experts of think tanks are often former members of Congress who have found a place of exile, as they often say, in a think tank, maintaining their political ties and exerting influence from this platform. Think tanks diffuse scenarios of the future of the world and the best ways to get there, specifically the best ways to get there. The intellectuals who work there are part, we could say, of a growing cadre of professionals engaged in producing global scenarios of cultural flows, financial flows, etc., and borders that enter the public geocultural imagination, as Ulf Hannertz has it. but the scenarios that are produced in the think tanks also, and more importantly, capture the imaginations of politicians and policymakers, often, as we know, by way of seductive sound bites like the clash of civilizations, the end of history, the world is flat. We know them. In the anthropologist Anna Singh's terms, they are engaged in what she calls scale-making activities. And here I use scale-making in both the spatial and the ideological sense. So, think tanks are in a position to wield a form of soft power, in Joseph Nye's terms, which works essentially by way of attraction, mobilization, agenda setting, persuasion, you could even say seduction, rather than by coercion and sanction. And this soft power, I argue, is relational, and that it relies on a relationship between agent and subject. It's also situational in the sense that it is, or what is a valuable resource in the wielding of power varies with context. As for the relational component, we know that power has always been heavily reliant on personal associations, interlocking networks and linkages. And starting with C. Wright Mills and his influential book, The Power Elite, way back in 1956, several scholars since have described the intimate connections between elites and people with power, suggesting also that connectivity is becoming ever more complex with globalization. Politicians and policymakers and corporate leaders carefully nurture relationships with others that they see to be strategically positioned. And events such as the World Economic Forum, the BAO Forum for Asia, the UN Global Compact Leaders Summit, along with thousands of others of similar conferences, knit people with power together. And I've argued elsewhere that this adds up to a huge economy of connections. Now, the contextual dimension is evident in the large-scale organizational level, where globalization has triggered the development of new and more flexible forms of exerting influence. And we know these as governance tools such as soft law or network governance, and I'm not going to go deeper into those here. But the important thing, in my point of view, is that these types of governance tools and networks seem to favor consensus and harmony seeking more than clear articulation of political positionings. As Miller and Rose have it, political power today is exercised through a profusion of shifting alliances between diverse authorities. And the common political vocabulary that is structured by differences between state, civil society, public and private, coercion and consent, and such like, is really unable to characterize the very diverse and complex ways that power is exercised through in advanced liberal democracies at global level. So, to analyze contemporary power, we do need to relocate the state and the market, to really rethink these neat categories, also the categories of politics and non-politics, to investigate more broadly the problematics of government and governance. So what it really adds up to in the world of think tanks is think tanks advising, educating, and informing, because they cannot lobby in the strict sense of the term, legally that is. Doing so-called deep lobbying, and I'll come back to that in a moment, just because they do not have the mandate to do political sort of influencing in the strict sense. They are 501c3 types of organizations according to US corporate law. They are involved in scale-making activities spatially and ideologically, and they exercise a form of soft power. Now, central here is knowledge. Knowledge is pivotal for these activities, as it is through claims to expertise, not actual expertise always, that governance is executed through attempts to influence, mobilize, encourage, convince, seduce. And consequently, the possible power that a particular think tank can acquire and execute is really not so much power in an overt, formal, and legal sense of the word, but rather power in the form of authority. Obviously, what I'm suggesting here is not that these forms of power are entirely novel phenomena, but that with globalization, new means of connectivity and challenges to established forms of regulation, power is becoming more difficult to locate, more nomadic, and more intertwined in complex relational networks and assemblages of influence. However, we should not be blinded to this kind of authority and power. The authority upon which think tanks rely is fragile. Think tanks need to borrow some of the authority of their members. Without the credibility of senior fellows and experts, the reports, the policy briefings, the op-eds would be very thin. And really, without the financial support of donors, the possibility of think tanks to do research and to influence would be very slim. Think tanks have been conspicuous actors in US domestic and international policy for about a century, and they are a much more established feature in American society than they are, for example, in Europe. I'm not going to go through the history of think tanks in the US just now, but just to show you, give you an idea of the global distribution. In the US, the growth of government administration over the recent decades and the need to find so-called winter habitats for those waiting for a new political administration to come on board have in general boosted the growth of think tanks. What is really remarkable here about the development is the exponential growth over the last few decades, and in particular the growth of more ideologically and advocacy-oriented think tanks, particularly conservative or liberal ones. So in a general sense, we have a move from think tanks to think and do tanks, and even do tanks, as they are often called. Think tanks in the US are also globalizing, setting up operational quarters all across the world, entering into network alliances. But also, there is a very interesting and intriguing geographical clustering of think tanks in the US around DC, as we know. Here I'd like to make use of Professor Sassen's idea of new sites of normativity, suggesting that think tanks are vital in opening up new sites of normativity. We are seeing here a proliferation of normative orders where once the state normativity ruled, and the dominant logic was towards producing a unitary normative framing. Think tanks are now contributing to a much more complex picture with specialized assemblages of different types of organizations working in the political field. And these are together disrupting the geopolitical architecture as we know it. They are also challenging the social contract of liberal states, the idea of modern citizenship, representativity, and also the formal mechanisms that render certain claims legitimate and others not. This development, then, addresses the problem of globalization and global governance with a view to organizational constellations that we could say escape the grid of national institutional frames. So think tanks may be understood as sites of normativity, and the principal task is to generate knowledge, distribute, disseminate, to influence, advocate, and to advise. I spent most of my time doing fieldwork inside an organization called Center for Global Development, and this is where I did participant observation, but I also took part in a number of conferences and meetings and made interviews in other think tanks, one of them being Cato. And this was at a time when debt was really on top of the agenda. So how do they go about trying to seduce and convince and argue for their point, which is less government interference? Well, at Cato, there is a a mix of so-called distanciation techniques using graphs, tables, and other numeric devices to sort of make the complex picture of debt globally and domestically comprehensible from a bird's eye point of view, possible to graph through numbers, developmental trajectories, scenarios, and so on, that really condense huge amounts of information into simple numerical representations. But that's not the whole picture. To be able to convince, to be able to seduce, and to get the message across, they really need to also make use of, I'll stick to this, yes, thank you, what I have called approximation techniques, making the complex problems of debt and financial crisis sort of more closer to home, more intimate, and family related. And this was very evident in the analogy that one of the former senators and now senior expert at Cato used to make his point. We love this government. We love the things that it does, that it stands for, and because we love it, we can't allow it to be in a position where it's harming other people. And just because, like my grandparents couldn't simply be told you've got to be more careful when driving the Oldsmobile that you saw in the previous picture, Congress can't simply be told again you've got to be more careful. You have to put Congress in what I refer to as an economic straitjacket. We should take charge, and here he pulled out his keys of his pocket, showing the keys, saying we should take charge of the keys of the federal government until they learn to act responsibly. So by doing this, he was using approximation technique, bringing the problem closer to home, making it more easy to understand, and just appearing like simple, good reason. So, I'm suggesting that think tanks act as brokers between knowledge and politics, and that they exercise their mandate not by lobbying in the strict sense of the term, but by doing soft power, that is, convincing, arguing, seducing their audiences to take on their argument. And this is the kind of citation that I often got. There's a thin line between lobbying and not lobbying. That is, we want to influence legislation, but we do it by seeding ideas and not by lobbying. So I would also like to end by suggesting that brokering, as I understand it, is much more than the simple act of bricolage, as Lévi-Strauss would have it, because the broker doesn't just take what is at hand, as the bricoleur does, but creates new kinds of value, in this case, new kinds of information and policy-relevant information by adding on between the brokering parties, translating by means of distanciation and approximation techniques, and making use of their intertwinement into powerful networks, making use of their positions in these influential assemblages, or what I have called economies of networks. Thank you.
So I have a quick observation and a question. First is the hold it closer. Okay, you can hear me, right? Yeah. So one observation is think tanks. They educate, but they don't have to teach, so they have more time, you know, compared to academicians. So they don't have to teach. The entire time is for whatever they do. But I had more question about think tanks if they have a position of power vis-a-vis democracy, you know, because in India what we see is it is becoming exceedingly difficult to fool the people, even if they are poor and they are. So how does think tanks as powerful agents vis-a-vis, you know, the masses? So democracy. So do you see any connection there?
That's a very good question. It's a very tricky one too, and one that I often get, especially in Sweden, where we are not very used to think tanks, but we do see them as a threat to democracy. But there is the other side of it. I mean, they are civil society organizations, and they do open up spaces for discussion, deliberation, education, research, and knowledge seeking outside of traditional academia, which is not open to everyone, let's face it. So they do have a role to fill in democracy and in representational democracy. However, the problem is that we can question the kinds of knowledge that are produced, the basis upon which knowledge is gathered, because they are often funded by corporations, wealthy individuals, foundations, and sometimes by trade unions and political parties. So the independence of the knowledge gathering can rightfully be questioned. Another thing is that they do influence politicians. We see this very clearly at the European level also around Brussels, where they provide advice for the European Commission in something that Chris Shore, the anthropologist, has called comitology. It's becoming a common feature throughout the world. This means that they challenge representational practices. And they sort of work behind the scenes, in the shadows of the established channels of representational democracy. And that is a threat to democracy as we know it, and to the kinds of processes of political mobilization of the masses that you brought up.
Thank you, Christina. This is very interesting. But I'm wondering that is this you are just the first step of your research on global think tank, or you plan to extend the research plan further? If you plan to extend the research plan further, then I have two suggestions for your future direction. One is to research this think tank by subject, which means this may be a more concrete step. For example, by studying food security, by studying science, by studying more political sensitive issues like political system, ideology, history, or even international law. Because my perception is that you will see very interesting distinction of these think tanks. Some subjects may be more neutral, for example, the scientific ones. But some, you will see that regional perception will vary a lot. For example, international law. In Asia, there are a lot of many interpretations, and explicitly China is emergent, and it has the power to kind of cast challenges to the conventional ones. That will be my suggestion for the first step. The other one is more like a conceptual one and maybe more challenging, which is I see now a trend of internationalization of knowledge. And the theme is more like a westernized, to be honest. But I mean, apparently, some regional blocks are kind of emergent. And I will, again, put China or East Asia as an example, because now there are a lot of criticism in China that we should develop our own knowledge system. We cannot just copy whatever these students going to America studying, and when they come back, we just bring everything they learn from the United States and copy them. But apparently, it doesn't really fit into different countries and with different cultural backgrounds. So this second step may be more challenging, and it may take a long time, and you may follow that, which means that different thinking or knowledge system emergent, and how does the global think tank or regional think tank deal with that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, this is research that have been ongoing for some years already and will continue for many years. I'm already following some topics from within the think tank that I know best, the Center for Global Development, specifically to do with international development. And so, of course, you're right that they do specialize in sectors, also ideologically, and in terms of issues, and it's really a jungle out there. So in order to get some, clarity of it all, you need to focus on a few single issues, which I am also doing, although I didn't present it here. The other topic about the local global is, of course, also on my mind, and I have previously been studying multinationals, corporations, and the dynamics between the local and the global, the shaping of global sort of templates for culture, for strategy, for innovation, and so on, and the local sort of creative translation, if you wish, or creolization processes. So that's not at all unfamiliar territory to me, and some thing that I will take on. I'm also studying at this point Swedish think tanks and so-called policy intellectuals in the Swedish landscape, which is an entirely different story than what you would get from the US. So that's also ongoing, but thank you very much. That's very constructive comments.
Shall I go? Hi, thanks for the talk. So you said in passing, I misunderstood perhaps, but I just confirm, you mentioned something about think tanks as sites for normativity or for making norms? Sort of. And so what I wanted to ask you is I've struggled for quite a bit to track the following issue. Norms that, say, the financial sector wants implemented, but it cannot implement it as a financial firm. So the challenge is to get those norms installed into national public law. And when I look at think tanks, especially the United States, which is really a nœud de vipère, sort of situation there, I think think tanks don't really make norms, but they channel norms. Maybe there are some that make norms. There are too many to really know. And so I wanted to know whether you have given some thought about this, that I don't see think tanks as making norms. They really are this big intermediary. And one way also of looking at it is to say that, in a way, what we are seeing is more and more intermediation in domains where before there was no intermediation. So now the think tank is making sure that certain norms get to be part of public policy and even public law. I don't know if you have thought about that.
Oh, I've thought about it a lot. Thank you. And I don't have an answer yet. To be honest, I sort of move between positions here. It also depending on what kind of issue I confront and what think tank, more specifically, that I am looking at. I have been sort of playing around with the notion of bricolage as it has been developed by Lévi-Strauss to figure out what think tanks are up to. And according to this notion, they take what is at hand. They don't produce norms, that is, or novelties or innovations, but they really work from what there is at hand. It's a limited universe sort of ideas that they can craft or work with. But that doesn't really capture the entire picture, because there's more going on to it as I see it. Perhaps you wouldn't go so far as to say they are creating new norms or sort of something innovative, that would sort of change the political or policy landscape. That's not the right picture either. But they are more powerful than mere intermediaries, in my view. They are able to sort of translate and to hybridize, creolize, whatever term you wish to use, or edit norms that are sort of out there and to channel them onto new kinds of audiences. So I do think they are more powerful than mere sort of bricoleurs. Yeah, well, again, it depends on the issue. I mean, you do see issues where they have no say at all, but you also do see issues where they have what they would call impact. I mean, not just influence, but influence transposed onto something real, like a change of a bill or a piece of legislation. You do see evidence of that. But you certainly see that they do shape agendas, perceptions of what a problem is out there and how it should be dealt with and so on. Yes, the intermediary world is a strong one, but again, I mean, you have to look at the empirical specific case to tell what kind of influence they have. Yeah.
Last question.
Great talk. I was just wondering, so the question about power is also one of relative power. So in a fast-moving world, global, international, continuous new developments, for governments to know what is happening and to know what has to be regulated, it almost has to rely on, it has to engage in some form of bricolage itself. And there are many ways of representing society, and they could be one actor, these think tanks, in that mediating role. Now, that they have influence is clear. Now, what is their relative influence? So the question for me is that they are a given. So in their impact, how do they have competitive advantage sort of in the entire sphere of influence is something that I would also be interested in. So have you seen that? If you look at the Center for Global Development and the tactics they use about approximation and distanciation, or Cato, how do they thrive relative to other actors that use the exact same tactics for power and influence?
Tricky question. Yeah, sure, power is relative. Again, depending on what and when and where and so on. And it's very difficult to measure the impact of think tanks, and a lot has been written on this, also academically. They do try to do that themselves, obviously, and I have had a lot of interesting discussions with the fellows at think tanks, particularly Center for Global Development, about impact on a specific issue, or maybe not impact, but influence. So there is no real way to assert the degree of relative power that they are able to exert, but that's something that is constantly, every day discussed within the think tank. There are a few cases where you would say that they have had strong impact relative to other powerful actors in the area relating to the specific topic at hand. For example, in influencing aid to Pakistan, in the case of Center for Global Development. On other topics, you don't see any impact at all, and they do recognize that their knowledge resembles what they would say academic knowledge, in that it's a desk product that nobody really reads or pays any attention to. A bit disappointing to hear, but so that they do every day discuss the relative impact that they have, or influence, power, but there is no conclusion to be drawn. It's a constant discussion.
Thank you very much, Christina.
Thank you.